My dad blamed me for wrecking his marriage before I was even born. He flat out refused to walk me down the aisle because, according to him, he needed to be with his real daughter during my wedding. Yeah, you read that right. His real daughter. Let me explain. My mom and dad had my sister, Emily, when they were pretty young. It was just the three of them for years, almost like their own little squad. Since both my parents were all about their careers, they passed that same ambition on to Emily from the start. It was like they had this unspoken pact. Work hard, aim higher, and squeeze every ounce of success out of life. But, of course, when you're so laser-focused on making it big, cracks start to form. Life with all that pressure isn't as perfect as it looks from the outside. By the time I came into the picture, things were already falling apart between my parents. They were so wrapped up in their jobs that their relationship took a major hit. For some reason, my dad got it in his head that my mom was having an affair. Looking back, I think he was just letting his insecurities run wild. My parents weren't spending any quality time together anymore. No date nights, no quiet moments. They were like two ships passing in the night, and my dad's mind went to the worst possible place. But here's the thing. My mom wasn't seeing anyone else. She was just trying to juggle a demanding job, take care of Emily, and keep the household running. She was completely overwhelmed, and instead of supporting her, my dad started playing detective in his own head. Then, one day, everything changed. My mom collapsed out of nowhere while she was at work. At first, everyone assumed it was just extreme stress catching up with her. But when they rushed her to the hospital, the doctors dropped a bombshell. She was 3 months pregnant with me. Here's the kicker. She had no idea. Between her intense job, running the house, and raising Emily, the signs of her pregnancy completely flew under the radar. But when my dad found out, it wasn't the happy surprise you'd hoped for. Nope. His first reaction wasn't joy, or even shock. It was doubt. He flat out refused to believe the baby my mom was carrying was his. My mom was heartbroken. Imagine working yourself to the bone for your family, only to be accused of cheating by your own husband. It was like a punch to the gut for her. They argued constantly after that, and the tension was unbearable. My mom fought back, bitterly defending herself, insisting over and over that she had never been unfaithful. But my dad was so tangled up in his own paranoia that he refused to listen. Emily, who was old enough to understand what was going on, has told me that my dad stormed out that very night. He told my mom he wouldn't set foot back in the house until she could prove I was his child. When the DNA results came back and confirmed I was, in fact, my dad didn't know what to say. He was completely floored, like all the wind had been knocked out of him. My grandparents, his parents, were furious. They ripped into him for treating my mom so terribly, especially after everything she'd done to keep their family afloat. They told him point blank he was a lousy husband for doubting her, and they made it clear they were siding with my mom. I can only imagine how humiliated my dad must have felt, but honestly, he deserved it. My mom had stayed loyal to him through everything and carried the weight of their family, and this was how he repaid her. My grandparents didn't let up, and between their anger and the realization of how much he'd hurt my mom, my dad had no choice but to grovel for forgiveness. He moved back in, but it was obvious to everyone that things between him and my mom were never going to be the same. My mom made sure of that. She was done bending over backward to keep everything running smoothly while my dad sat back. She told him straight up that things were going to change, and if he didn't step up, she wasn't afraid to leave. It wasn't an empty threat. It was her drawing a line in the sand. See, my mom had always been the one to go above and beyond. She juggled her demanding career, took care of Emily, and ran the household without ever asking for much in return. But after what my dad put her through, she realized just how much she'd been sacrificing. She wasn't about to keep carrying that load by herself. My dad didn't have a choice. If he wanted to stay, he had to do things her way, and for the first time in their marriage, my mom held the power. Sure, they reconciled, but the trust between them was cracked, maybe beyond repair. My mom wasn't willing to go the extra mile anymore. Not for him, not for the marriage. She had already done more than her share, and now it was up to him to pick up the slack. And that is why, to this day, my dad seems to think I'm the reason for all their problems. It's like he blames me for the fallout in their marriage, even though none of it was my fault. My dad's grudge against me ran deep, and it all tied back to the cracks in their marriage. In his mind, I was the reason their relationship fell apart, the reason he started doubting my mom, the reason their marriage was never the same afterward. It sounds ridiculous, I know. Honestly, it's childish, but that's just how he operates. To him, my very existence was like a trigger that unraveled everything they had. And because of that, he's held this bizarre resentment toward me my whole life. He has always managed to keep me at arm's length, like I was some outsider he was forced to tolerate. What makes it worse is how two-faced he is about it. Around other people, he's all smiles and warmth, kind, pleasant, even affectionate toward me, like he's this perfect dad. But the moment it's just us, or even just me, him, and my mom or Emily, it's like a switch flips. His whole demeanor changes, and he treats me with this cold, detached attitude, as if I am some unwelcome presence in his life. I've felt his dislike toward me for as long as I can remember. Even Emily, my sister, remembers how distant and indifferent he was when I was born. She's told me stories about how he barely lifted a finger when it came to taking care of me as a baby. If I cried, he'd just ignore it. He wouldn't pick me up, try to comfort me, or even check to see if I was okay. That was left to my mom, Emily, or whoever else was around. Anyone but him. It was like he decided from day one that I wasn't his responsibility. In his eyes, I was just an unnecessary addition to their lives, a mistake he had to endure. And let me tell you, he made sure I felt that. He made me feel like a burden, like I didn't belong. That feeling has stuck with me for my entire life. The only time my dad ever seemed to notice me, really see me, was when I achieved something. When I excelled at school or succeeded at something that reflected well on him, that's when he'd suddenly pay attention. By the time I got to high school, I had turned into a total people-pleaser, desperate for any scrap of his approval. I poured all my energy into my grades, hoping that if I worked hard enough, I could win him over. I thought if I achieved enough, if I made him proud, maybe he'd finally look at me like I mattered. Getting my dad to acknowledge me always felt like there was a price attached. His attention was never free. I had to earn it by performing, by being exceptional. It was never about love or connection. It was transactional. And for years, I chased that approval, convincing myself that maybe, just maybe, if I tried hard enough, he'd finally see me. But deep down, I think I always knew the truth. No matter how well I did, no matter how many A's I brought home or accolades I earned, it was never going to change the way he saw me. When I went off to college, it hit me harder than ever. No matter how much I pushed myself, I'd always fall short in comparison to Emily. In my dad's eyes, she was the star, and I was just the understudy. It did not matter how many achievements I stacked up. I was always going to be second place to her. That said, I never resented Emily for any of it. She and I have always been close, and honestly, I owe her so much. With the big age gap between us, she treated me more like her own child than a sibling. She was loving, nurturing, and protective in a way that my dad never was. She made it her mission to make sure I felt included, valued, and loved, and for that, I will always be grateful. But as much as I love her, I would be lying if I said I did not feel a tiny bit jealous of the bond she has with our dad. They have this connection, this closeness, that I have always been on the outside of. Part of me has always longed for that same kind of relationship with him, but no matter how much my mom tried to push him to include me, it just never happened. He made it clear that I did not belong in that part of their world. My mom worked so hard to get him to make an effort, to be present for me in the way he was for Emily. But it always felt like his heart just wasn't in it when it came to me. He'd go through the motions, sure, but you could tell his actions were hollow, like he was just checking a box. That hurt more than I can even put into words. By the time I graduated college, I had a moment of reckoning. I realized I'd spent the better part of my life chasing after something I was never going to get. His approval, his attention, his love. I had been over backward trying to win him over, but it had left me drained. I was exhausted, and I knew I couldn't keep running on empty like that anymore. For so long, I felt like I wasn't enough, like I was chasing something I could never catch. Eventually, I decided I had to stop. I stopped running after my dad, stopped trying to make him see me, and instead, I turned inward. That was when I started therapy. It gave me the space I needed to unpack all the pain, the frustration, and the feelings of abandonment I had carried for years. Therapy was hard at first. Confronting all those emotions wasn't easy, but it helped me begin to heal. It helped me understand that the problem wasn't me, and that realization was freeing in a way I didn't think was possible. Once I let go of the need for my dad's validation, I was finally able to focus on what truly mattered, myself. I poured my energy into my personal growth and my career. For years, I worked hard, building a life that wasn't defined by his approval but by my own goals and passions. It wasn't an overnight process, and there were definitely setbacks, but over time, I reached a place of peace. I accepted that I might never have the relationship I always wanted with him, and for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. Then, 3 years ago, John walked into my life, and everything changed. From the moment we met, we just clicked. He's tall, charming, and so easy to talk to, and it didn't take long for us to fall head over heels for each other. Being with John has made me stronger. He's my rock, always encouraging me to grow and supporting me every step of the way. One of the things I love most about him is how he handles everything with my family. He knows all about my complicated history with my dad, the ups, the downs, and all the messy in-between, and he has never once judged me for it. In fact, he can't stand my dad, and honestly, I don't blame him. Whenever John has had to meet my dad at family events, like lunches or gatherings, he makes a point of keeping his distance. It's subtle, but I think it's his way of standing up for me. My dad ignored me for most of my life, so now John ignores him right back. If they do talk, it's brief and polite, with John giving short, surface-level answers. My dad has never said anything to me about it, but I'm sure he's noticed. He just won't acknowledge it, probably because he knows John is treating him the exact same way he's treated me all these years. A few months ago, John proposed, and of course, I said yes. Since then, we've been deep in wedding planning, excited to start this new chapter together. Both John and I have great jobs, and we're on the same page about staying child-free. That's given us the financial freedom to plan the wedding of our dreams without having to worry about saving for kids down the line. Thanks to the financial freedom John and I have, we've been able to set aside plenty of money to make our wedding a true celebration. We've invited all our family and friends, even those who live far away, to join us. It feels amazing to plan one big day where we can celebrate our love and everything we've built together, surrounded by the people who mean the most to us. It really feels like the perfect way to kick off the next chapter of our lives. During all the wedding planning, my mom kept bringing up one thing. She thought I should ask my dad to walk me down the aisle. It was something I'd considered briefly, but I never felt right about it. Given my complicated history with him, the idea just did not sit well with me. I could not imagine having him play that role on one of the most important days of my life. For a lot of people, having their dad walk them down the aisle holds deep sentimental value. But for me, it didn't mean much. Instead, I knew exactly who I wanted to do the honors. My uncle, my mom's brother. My uncle is one of my absolute favorite people in the world, right up there with my mom and Emily. He's always been a supportive, fun, and steady presence in my life, filling a role my dad never really cared to. Choosing him to walk me down the aisle felt natural. It just made sense that he would be the one by my side as I stepped into this new chapter with John. When I shared my decision with my mom, though, she wasn't exactly thrilled. In fact, she went on a bit of a rant. She told me it would be insensitive to ask my uncle when my dad is still alive. She was worried about how it would look to the rest of the family. She kept saying that people would find it weird or even disrespectful if I chose someone other than my dad for such a traditional role. I could see where she was coming from, at least a little. A father walking his daughter down the aisle is a tradition, one that a lot of people hold dear. To outsiders, it might seem strange or even inappropriate to break away from that. But for me, this wasn't about tradition or appearances. It wasn't about what other people expected. It was about choosing someone who had truly been there for me, someone I shared a genuine connection with, something I never had with my dad. Still, I felt torn. On one hand, I wanted to honor my mom's wishes and avoid stirring up any unnecessary drama with the extended family. On the other, this was my wedding day, and I wanted it to reflect my own choices, my own values. It felt like a tug of war between what I wanted and what everyone else expected. After weeks of my mom insisting, I reluctantly gave in to her wishes and agreed to ask my dad to walk me down the aisle. Even though it wasn't what I truly wanted, I figured it was important to her. Part of me also just wanted to avoid any more conflict or drama leading up to the wedding. But when I finally worked up the nerve to ask my dad, his reaction was even worse than I expected. Instead of being touched or even considering the gesture, he acted like I had asked him something offensive. He flat out told me he had never even thought about walking me down the aisle. Then, as if that wasn't bad enough, he said something that hit me like a brick. He didn't really see me as his real daughter. As hurtful as those words were, they didn't shock me. I've heard him say similar things before. After years of his coldness, I've almost grown numb to it. I sighed, trying to push forward with the conversation anyway. I explained how much it meant to Mom, hoping that if I framed it that way, as something that wasn't even about me or him, maybe he'd soften up. Maybe he'd agree, if only for the sake of family harmony. But my dad just shrugged, completely indifferent. Then he went on to argue that the only daughter he ever wanted to walk down the aisle was Emily. For context, Emily has made it very clear to everyone that she plans to remain single for life. She's completely against the idea of marriage, and while my parents have been frustrated by her decision, that's a whole other story. Still, hearing my dad say, so bluntly, that Emily was the only one he ever considered his daughter for something as symbolic as walking her down the aisle cut deep. It was like he couldn't even fathom seeing me in that role. He wasn't done, either. He casually suggested that I didn't really need anyone to walk me down the aisle at all. He called it nonsense tradition, like it was a waste of time and energy. It was his way of brushing off the entire thing, but it only confirmed what I've known for years. I was never going to get that father-daughter moment, not even on my wedding day. I didn't argue with him after that. There didn't seem to be any point. I just left the conversation feeling defeated, but not surprised. It was yet another reminder of the emotional distance that has always existed between us. When I got home and had time to think about it, I realized I couldn't let his indifference ruin such an important day. So, I followed my heart. I asked my uncle if he would walk me down the aisle. When I asked my uncle to walk me down the aisle, he was absolutely thrilled. He said yes right away, and the excitement and honor in his voice reassured me that I had made the right decision. His genuine happiness made me feel so much better about everything, and for the first time in a while, I felt truly at peace with the choice I had made. I also talked to Emily and my mom about my conversation with my dad and how he had refused to walk me down the aisle. While they were both disappointed in him, they weren't exactly shocked. My dad's behavior over the years has set a pretty low bar. Emily, in particular, was frustrated. She's always been more aware of how differently he has treated me compared to her. Both Emily and my mom told me I made the right call. If my dad didn't want to be there for me, then asking my uncle was absolutely the best choice. Their support meant so much to me, and it helped take the sting out of what had happened. On the day of the wedding, my uncle proudly walked me down the aisle. That moment was everything I had hoped it would be: beautiful, emotional, and full of love. I couldn't have asked for a better person to stand by my side. As I walked toward John, I felt overwhelmed by joy, and the love from everyone there made the whole day feel magical. The ceremony was incredible. When John and I read our vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Everyone was moved by the raw emotion and sincerity of our words. It was one of those moments that felt absolutely perfect, like the culmination of all the love and hard work we had poured into our relationship. My dad attended the wedding, but true to form, he barely interacted with John or me. He didn't come up to congratulate us, and during the family photos, he stayed off to the side, acting like we weren't even there. I tried not to let it ruin my day. Instead, I focused on the people who truly cared about me and were genuinely happy to celebrate with us. That said, it seems like my dad's strange behavior didn't go unnoticed by the other guests. After the wedding, word started to spread about how he had refused to walk me down the aisle. I am not entirely sure whether it was Emily, my mom, or my uncle who let it slip, but whoever it was, they made sure people knew the truth. Since then, my dad has been getting an earful from various family members and wedding guests. Apparently, My dad has been getting an earful from all directions. Family members have been openly criticizing him, calling him a deadbeat father and sarcastically congratulating him for being such a poor excuse for a dad. My mom was the one who told me about it, and she couldn't help but laugh as she filled me in on what he's been going through. I have to admit, it is kind of satisfying to see him finally being held accountable by so many people in the family. At first, I figured this whole situation would blow over eventually, but last week, my dad started leaving me voicemails. In them, he practically begged me to clear the air with everyone. He wanted me to tell people that he had been there for me, that he had done his best as a father. His goal was pretty obvious. He wanted me to fix his image and stop the backlash he was getting. Of course, I refused. Why would I lie for him? It wasn't true, and I wasn't about to start rewriting history just to protect his reputation. After a few failed attempts to convince me, I thought he'd finally given up. But then today, he reached out again, and this time he was even more direct. He demanded that I clear his name because, according to him, the fallout with the family was getting serious. He claimed it was damaging his relationships and, get this, that it could even affect Emily's future wedding. He went on and on about how if this bad blood with the family continued, Emily might not even ask him to walk her down the aisle. If she ever decided to get married, of course. And apparently, all of this was somehow my fault. He accused me of throwing a tantrum by not defending him, saying I was ruining everything for him. I was livid. I mean, the nerve of this man. Not once has he apologized for how he treated me or acknowledged how hurtful his actions have been. He wasn't reaching out because he cared about making things right with me. No, he was only concerned about himself and Emily, his precious relationship with her, and what she might do or not do in some hypothetical future was all he cared about. I didn't hold back. I firmly told him I wasn't going to lie for him or clear his name. I reminded him that he had made it painfully clear over the years that he didn't see me as his daughter. So, as far as I was concerned, he had no right to make these demands, or even contact me about this issue at all. I told him he needed to deal with the mess he created. This was not my problem, and I wasn't going to be dragged into it just because he's finally facing the consequences of his actions. After our last conversation, I made it clear that my dad would need to face this mess on his own. His actions over the years had led to the way everyone in the family now sees him, and I wasn't about to step in and clean up a situation he had created entirely by himself. Since that afternoon, he's been bombarding me with messages. He keeps trying to guilt-trip me, saying things like how unfair it is that the family now views him negatively, or how I'm making his life harder for no reason. It's almost laughable how he's painted himself as the victim in all this, completely ignoring the years of emotional neglect and pain he caused me. Honestly, it's beyond frustrating. Thank you to everyone for your kind words. As many of you pointed out, my dad only cares about appearances. The fact that his actions are finally coming back to haunt him, damaging the image he so carefully tried to uphold, is all he really cares about. He has never cared about me, and honestly, he never will. If anything, this whole situation has only confirmed my decision to permanently distance myself from him. For those asking why I didn't cut him off earlier, it's because he was never a big part of my life to begin with. I had already learned to live without his presence or approval. The only reason this wound reopened was because my mom wanted me to ask him to walk me down the aisle. I thought maybe, just maybe, it could be an opportunity for some kind of reconciliation. But clearly, that was a mistake. My husband, John, stepped in and spoke to my dad earlier today. He told him in no uncertain terms to back off. John didn't hold back. He made it clear that he agrees with the rest of the family who's been calling my dad a deadbeat, because that's exactly what he is. He told my dad that, despite all the resentment he's carried toward me, I've managed to achieve everything in my life without his support. John also let him know that now that we're married, he wasn't going to tolerate anyone treating his wife poorly, especially my dad. He firmly told my dad that if he had any more complaints, he should address them directly to him, not me. Since that conversation, my dad has been too afraid to send me any more texts. To everyone asking about my mom and Emily's role in all this, to clarify, my mom and Emily have never just let things slide when it comes to my dad's treatment of me. They've always had my back. But while they've supported me and stood up to him in the past, they can't fully control his behavior either. Now, for the actual update. I decided it was time to sit down and have a serious conversation with my mom. I told her everything. How difficult it had been for me growing up with a father who resented me so much. I opened up about how, for years, I tried to brush it off and act like it didn't bother me. But now that I'm a grown woman, married, and building a life of my own, I was done tolerating it. I explained how painful it was that my dad had blamed me for something completely out of my control ever since I was born. I told her that, ultimately, it felt like I had grown up without a father figure at all. Hearing this broke my mom's heart. She teared up and begged for my forgiveness, apologizing for not protecting me more when I was younger. She admitted that she should have stood up for me better. I also told her that, even though my dad had stopped texting me for now, I didn't trust that he wouldn't start pestering me again. I asked her to speak to him directly and tell him to back off because his behavior was starting to take a toll on my mental health. In the end, my mom gave me a long hug and promised that she would address the issue with him immediately. It turns out that she, along with Emily, my uncle, and even my paternal grandparents, staged an intervention for my dad. From what I've gathered, they all confronted him about how he has mistreated me for years. They called him out for blaming me when he should have been holding himself accountable for his own actions, like doubting his loyal wife and projecting that onto me. I don't know the exact details of what was said during the intervention, but it must have been pretty intense because my dad's attitude seemed to shift afterward. Following the intervention, my dad reached out to me again. This time, he offered a half-hearted apology. I have no doubt he was pressured into it, and while he acknowledged some of his wrongs, he didn't exactly take full accountability for them. In his half-hearted apology, my dad admitted that as much as he dislikes me, he's going to keep those feelings to himself moving forward and stop bothering me about it. He also apologized for refusing to walk me down the aisle and promised he would never ask me again to clear his name with the rest of the family. I decided to use this moment to set a firm boundary with him once and for all. I told him that, for the sake of my mental peace, I was cutting him out of my life. I wasn't willing to keep engaging with someone who had hurt me so deeply and so often. Surprisingly, he accepted my decision without much pushbar. It's been 7 months since I cut my dad out of my life, and I can honestly say I'm better for it. While I still see my family, I make sure to avoid any events where my dad will be present, and luckily, he's been doing the same. Interestingly enough, about 4 months ago, Emily decided to cut ties with him as well. She moved to a new city, and after settling in, she blocked him on everything. Social media, phone, you name it. When I asked her about it, she told me that she had always felt guilty over how our dad treated her so much better than me. That guilt had been weighing on her for years, and she'd been considering cutting him off for a while. Moving gave her the fresh start she needed to finally break free. My mom told me that my dad was devastated when he realized Emily didn't want a relationship with him anymore. But honestly, there's nothing he can do about it now. He made his choices, and now he has to live with the consequences. As for me, I feel lighter and happier than I have in years. For so long, I carried the weight of trying to earn his approval, of trying to figure out why I was never good enough in his eyes. Letting go of that, letting go of him, has been the healthiest decision I have ever made. These days, I'm fully focused on my life, my marriage, and the people who truly love and support me. If there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's that I don't need anyone's validation to know my worth.